We're waiting for you. Come closer.
If you look at a map of northern Maine, you'll see a place called Moosehead Lake region. It's remote, cold, and most of it is just endless pine forest that hasn't been touched in decades. About 8 years ago, when I was 19, this was the setting for the most terrifying weekend of my life. My uncle owned a hunting cabin out there. He didn't use it much anymore, just stored equipment, and occasionally went up for deer season, so most of the time it sat empty. When I asked if I could take my girlfriend Sarah camping near the property, he said it was fine. He gave me the keys and told me to help myself. We drove up on a Saturday morning. The cabin was already pretty isolated, sitting at the end of a muddy access road about 15 miles from the nearest paved highway. Before we left town, my uncle called me with a warning. "Just so you know," he said, loud enough that Sarah could hear on speakerphone. "There's been reports of a black bear in that area. Big male. He's been getting into trash cans. If you see him, make noise and back away slowly." Sarah looked nervous, but I brushed it off. I'd been camping dozens of times and never had a problem with bears. We decided not to stay at the cabin itself. We wanted the real wilderness experience, so we grabbed our packs and hiked about 2 miles into the dense forest behind the property. The woods up there are thick white pine, spruce, birch trees so close together you can barely see 20 feet in any direction. We found a small clearing next to a stream and set up camp. It was beautiful, peaceful. The sun was filtering through the canopy, making everything look green and golden. While Sarah organized our food supplies, I went looking for firewood. The forest floor was covered in fallen branches and pine cones. But as I was gathering wood, I noticed something odd. Carved into the bark of a birch tree about 10 feet from our tent was a singular circle with an X through it. It looked old. The bark had grown around it, but it was deliberate. "What do you think this means?" I asked Sarah. She shrugged. "Probably just trail markers from hunters or loggers." That made sense. We were on old hunting land, after all. We ignored it and finished setting up camp. Night fell fast. In the Maine woods, darkness is absolute. The trees block out the stars, and without a flashlight, you're completely blind. We sat around our fire, roasting hot dogs and telling stories. Every now and then, we'd hear a twig snap in the darkness, and I'd joke, "That's the bear. He smells your perfume." Sarah would punch my arm, but she was laughing. We put out the fire around 11 p.m. and crawled into our 2-person tent. The temperature had dropped hard, probably down to the low 40s, so we zipped our sleeping bags together for warmth. I fell asleep pretty quickly. I woke up to Sarah shaking me violently. "Someone's out there," she whispered. I sat up, groggy and confused. "What?" "Listen." I held my breath. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then I caught its footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling our tent. Not the quick scurry of an animal. Human footsteps. My heart started pounding. I checked my watch. It was 2:47 a.m. "Maybe it's a ranger," I whispered, trying to stay calm. But rangers don't walk circles around your tent in the middle of the night without announcing themselves. The footsteps stopped directly outside the tent door. We sat frozen, staring at the nylon wall. Then we heard breathing. Heavy, rasping breathing, like someone who'd been running. Sarah grabbed my hand so hard it hurt. Then came the scraping sound. Something sharp, maybe a stick, maybe a knife, was being dragged slowly across the top of the tent. The sound of it against the fabric made my skin crawl. It moved from one side to the other, then back again, methodical and deliberate. I wanted to yell, "Who's there?" But I was too terrified to make a sound. The scraping stopped. The footsteps resumed, moving away from the tent. I heard them crunched through the leaves, moving maybe 30 feet away. Then they stopped. Silence. We didn't move. We barely breathed. I was convinced that whoever it was still out there, watching us, waiting for us to make a move. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, I heard the footsteps again. But this time, they weren't circling. They were walking away, deeper into the woods. The sound faded completely. We didn't sleep. We sat there, clutching each other, jumping at every sound. When the first gray light of dawn finally crept into the tent, we packed up in under 10 minutes. We didn't fold anything. We just stuffed it all into our bags and ran. The hike back to the cabin felt like it took forever. We kept looking over our shoulders, convinced we'd see someone following us through the trees. When we finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat, I felt like I could breathe again. We threw our gear into my truck and drove straight back to town. I called my uncle on the way and told him everything. He listened quietly, then said something that made my blood run cold. "You said you camped near a stream." "Yeah, and you saw a circle with an X carved into a tree." "Yeah, why?" There was a long pause. "That area used to be hunting grounds for a trapper back in the 70s. Guy named Eugene Marsh. He lived alone out there for years. Then one winter he just disappeared. They never found his body. Some people think he went crazy from the isolation and is still out there living wild in the woods." I felt sick. "Are you serious?" "I don't know if it's true," my uncle said. "But locals avoid that area. The Circle X was his mark. He used to carve it on trees to mark his territory. We never went back." A few months later, I heard from a friend who worked for the Forestry Service that they found a makeshift shelter about a half-mile from where we decamped, just a tarp, strung between trees and a fire pit. Inside were old clothes, rusted tools, and dozens of trees around it carved with the Circle X symbol. I don't know if it was Eugene Marsh or someone else, but I know that whoever was circling our tent that night wasn't there to help us. This happened about 5 years ago in rural Wyoming, and it's the reason I'll never take a shortcut through back roads again. I was driving cross-country from California to Michigan to start a new job. It was a solo road trip, and I was trying to make good time. I'd been on the interstate for hours, and I was getting bored. When I saw a sign for a scenic route that would supposedly cut 50 miles off my trip, I took it without thinking. Big mistake. The road started out fine-paved 2 lanes, winding through open plains. But after about 30 minutes, the pavement ended and turned into gravel. Then the gravel got rougher. I was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but dry grass and distant mountains. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. It was around 7 p.m., and the sun was starting to set. I checked my phone. No service. My GPS had lost signal miles back. I kept driving, figuring the road had to connect to something eventually. That's when I saw the red pickup truck. It was parked on the side of the road up ahead, just sitting there with the engine off. As I got closer, I could see someone standing next to it, a man in a denim jacket and a baseball cap. He was waving at me. I slowed down. My first instinct was to help. Maybe he'd broken down, but something felt off. He wasn't waving like someone who needed help. He was waving like he wanted me to stop. Urgently, I pulled up next to him and rolled down my window halfway. "You okay?" I called out. He walked up to my car, smiling. "Hey man, thank God you stopped. I've been stuck out here for hours. My truck won't start. Can you give me a jump?" I looked at his truck. It was an old Ford beat-up and covered in dust. I didn't see any jumper cables. "I don't have cables," I said. "That's okay," he said quickly. "I've got some in the bed. Just need you to pop your hood." Everything about this felt wrong. The way he was standing too close to my car. The way his smile didn't reach his eyes. The fact that his truck looked fine, no hood up, no obvious signs of trouble. "Sorry man," I said. I'm in a hurry." I started to roll up my window, but he grabbed the edge of it. "Wait," he said, his voice changing. It wasn't friendly anymore. It was cold. "I really need your help." I hit the gas. My car lurched forward, and he had to let go or risk getting dragged. I didn't look back. I just drove. But when I checked my rearview mirror a few seconds later, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The red pickup truck's headlights had turned on. It was following me. I sped up. So did he. The road ahead was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for one car. I was doing 60, then 70, on loose gravel. My car was fishtailing, kicking up clouds of dust. The red truck stayed right behind me, maybe 20 feet back. My heart was pounding. I didn't know where this road led. I didn't know if there was anyone ahead who could help me. I just kept driving. Then I saw at a fork in the road. To the left, the road continued into the hills. To the right, there was a small sign that said Ranger Station 2, 3 miles. I yanked the wheel right, taking the turn so fast I almost flipped. The red truck followed. For the next 10 minutes, we raced down that narrow road. I could see his headlights in my mirror, never falling back, never getting closer, just there, watching. Finally, I saw lights ahead, a small building with a parking lot and a green Forest Service sign. I slammed on the brakes and skidded into the lot. There were 2 trucks parked outside and lights on inside. I jumped out of my car and ran to the door, pounding on it. A ranger opened it, a woman in her 40s with a confused expression. "Someone's chasing me," I gasped, pointing at the road. She looked past me. The road was empty. The red truck was gone. She took me inside and called the local sheriff. I gave them a description of the man and the truck. The sheriff said they'd patrol the area, but he didn't seem surprised. "We get reports like this every few months," he said. "Someone in a red pickup stopping people on that back road. Never found him." I spent the night in a motel in the nearest town. The next morning, I took the interstate the rest of the way. I still don't know what that guy wanted, but I know I made the right choice by not stopping. I'm a long-haul trucker, and I've driven just about every highway in the continental US. You see a lot of weird stuff when you're on the road 300 days a year. But this one night in New Mexico is something I'll never forget. It was late October, around 2 a.m. I was hauling a load from Albuquerque to Phoenix, taking Highway 60 through the middle of nowhere. The road out there is dead straight, cutting through empty desert for miles and miles. No towns, no gas stations, just scrub brush and darkness. I'd been driving for about 6 hours straight, and I needed to pull over. Not for gas, I still had half a tank, but just to stretch my legs and take a leak. That's when I saw the rest stop. It wasn't marked on my GPS, but there it was. A small concrete building with a single streetlight and a gravel parking lot. The light was flickering, casting weird shadows across the cracked pavement. There were no other cars there. I pulled in, shut off the engine, and climbed out of the cab. The air was cold and still. No wind, no sound, just that buzzing from the streetlight. The rest stop was elderly old. The concrete walls were stained and cracked, covered in graffiti. The men's bathroom door was half off its hinges. I pushed it open and immediately regretted it. The place stank like something had died in there. I decided I could wait. As I turned to walk back to my truck, I noticed something painted on the wall near the entrance. It was a message, spray painted in red. "Don't stay after 2 a.m. I checked my watch. 2:03 a.m. I laughed it off, probably just some kids messing around. But as I walked back toward my truck, I heard something that made me stop in my tracks, the door slamming. I spun around. There was a second building behind the rest stop that I hadn't noticed before, small maintenance shed. The door was swinging open and shut in the windless night, creaking on rusty hinges. Then I saw her. A woman was standing in the doorway of the shed. She was wearing a white dress, and her hair was hanging down over her face. She wasn't moving, just standing there. "Hello," I called out. She didn't respond. I took a step closer. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Slowly, she raised her head. I couldn't see her face clearly in the flickering light, but I could see enough. Her eyes were wrong. Too wide, too dark. She started walking toward me. I didn't wait to see what she wanted. I ran to my truck, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I started the engine, I looked in my side mirror. She was standing right next to my truck, staring up at me through the window. Her face was inches from the glass. I floored it, spraying gravel as I peeled out of the parking lot. I didn't look back. The next day I told another trucker about it at a truck stop in Phoenix. He went pale. "You stopped at the old rest stop on 60, he asked. "Yeah? Why?" "Man, that place has been closed for 20 years. There was a murder there back in the 90s. A woman was killed in the maintenance shed. Truckers say they still see her sometimes. I've driven that route 100 times since then. I've never seen that rest stop again." If you've ever looked at a map of rural Victoria, you'll know there are places where civilization just stops. Warri Yallock is one of those places. Dense bushland, endless quiet, and miles of nothing but eucalyptus trees and dry scrub. 15 years ago, when I was still in high school, this became the backdrop for a night that still makes me check over my shoulder. My old man owned property out there. A big patch of land with a house he barely used. Storage, mostly. Weekend getaways. The place sat empty most of the time, at the end of a long gravel drive that felt like it led to the edge of the world. I asked if I could take 2 mates, Matt and Chris, camping on the back acreage. Dad was cool with it. He drove us out on a Friday afternoon, helped us unload at the main house, then turned to me with that grin he always had when he was being a smartass. "Just so you know," he said, loud enough for the boys to hear, "I might sneak back out here tonight. Give you blokes a proper scare." Matt and Chris looked nervous. I laughed it off. Dad was always pulling pranks. I figured it'd be hilarious to see him jump out of the bushes later that night. We didn't want to camp near the house. That felt too easy. We wanted the real deal. So we loaded up our packs and started hiking into the bush that backed onto the property. For hours we walked, not on trails, through dense Australian scrub, pushing through shoulder-high ferns, climbing over fallen gum trees, dodging spider webs the size of car windows. By the time we found a clearing big enough for camp, the sun was sinking low, casting weird, long shadows through the trees. While Matt and Chris pitched the tents, I went hunting for firewood. That's when I noticed them, bones, scattered around the edge of the clearing. Lots of them, old sun-bleached, some so porous they looked like driftwood. I called the guys over. "What the hell is that?" Chris asked, looking queasy. "Cow bones," I said, trying to sound confident. "This used to be farmland, way back. Cattle probably wandered off and died out here." It was a logical explanation. We accepted it. Being teenage boys, we even tried to make it edgier than it was. Threw a few of the wood-like bones into the fire pit we dug, just to see if they'd burn. They did, cracking and popping in a way that was unsettling, but we ignored it. Night fell like a hammer. In the Australian bush, darkness is absolute. You can't see your hand in front of your face without a torch. We sat around the fire eating canned food and talking rubbish. I decided to use Dad's warning to mess with my mates. Every time a twig snapped in the darkness, I'd whisper, "He's out there," or "I think I saw something." Matt and Chris were jumpy as hell. I found it hilarious. We killed the fire around midnight and crawled into our 3-man tent. Cramped, but exhaustion from the hike knocked us out pretty quick. I woke up to a hand shaking my shoulder. "Wake up," Matt hissed. His voice was shaking. I rubbed my eyes, annoyed. "What?" "There's a light outside." I sat up and looked at the tent wall. Sure enough, a beam of light was sweeping across the fabric. Bright, definitely LED. Excellent, I thought. Dad actually came through. I checked my watch. 1:00 a.m. I nudged Chris awake so he wouldn't miss the show. We sat in silence for a minute. The light vanished, then swung back, fixing directly on our tent. It stayed steady, lighting up the outline of the fly sheet. Perfect. I decided to really ham it up. "You guys hear about those escaped prisoners from the Melbourne Remand Center?" I said, trying to sound scared. "They said they were heading east." "Shut up, man," Chris whimpered. He sounded on the verge of tears. The lights switched off. We sat in the dark, straining our ears. That's when we heard the footsteps. Heavy boots crunching on dry leaves. Snapping sticks. Close, really close. Then came the whispering. Low, indistinct mumbling. It sounded like 2 or 3 people having a quiet, aggressive argument. I frowned in the dark. Dad brought mates. That's dedicated. I expected him to jump out and yell boo any second, but he didn't. The mumbling continued, circling the tent. It was weird. I couldn't make out a single word, but the tone wasn't playful. It sounded angry. Suddenly, the torch clicked back on. This time, it wasn't from a distance. The light was pressed physically against the tent wall, right near my head. I recoiled, my heart skipping. Then a hand pressed against the fabric. I watched the outline of fingers dragging slowly across the top of the tent. Duh. The sound of the nylon stretching and scratching under the fingernails was agonizingly loud in the silence. The whispering didn't stop. It got closer. Right by the vent, the fingers drummed rhythmically on the tent pole. A cold realization washed over me, killing my amusement instantly. We had hiked for hours through dense, trailless bush. It was 1:00 Q. Would my dad really convince a group of his mates to trek through snake-infested scrub in the middle of the night just to shine a torch on a tent and whisper for 20 minutes? Dad was a joker, but he was also lazy. He wouldn't put in this much effort, which meant the people outside weren't my dad. I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked at Matt and Chris. They were huddled together, eyes wide, tears streaming down their faces in silence. I put a finger to my lips, signaling them to be absolutely quiet. The tapping continued. Then the light swept away from the tent and shone into the surrounding trees. We heard the crunching footsteps walk away a few meters, then stop, then walk back. It felt like they were pacing, assessing us. My mind was racing. We had no cell service. We were miles from the nearest road. We had no weapons, just a small pocket knife in my bag. If they wanted to come in, there was nothing we could do to stop them. For the next hour we sat in total silence. The only sound inside the tent was the shallow, shaky breathing of my friends. Outside, the mumbling would start and stop. Occasionally, a stick would snap right next to our heads. Then, around 2 a.m., it just stopped. No footsteps walking away. No fading voices. Just sudden, total silence. That was almost worse. We didn't know if they'd left, or if they were standing right outside in the dark, listening to us breathe. We didn't sleep. We didn't move. We just sat there, frozen, waiting for the tent zipper to slide down. The sun came up slowly. As soon as the gray light of dawn hit the tent, we unzipped the door. I peeked out first, terrified I'd see a face staring back. The clearing was empty. We didn't speak. We packed the tent in record time, literally shoving the fabric into the bags without folding it. We left the fire pit. We left the trash. We just grabbed our packs and ran. The hike back took us 2.5 hours because we were moving so fast, driven by fear. We kept looking over our shoulders, convinced we'd see figures following us through the ferns. When we finally burst out of the tree line and saw the house, I felt like collapsing. We ran up the driveway. Dad's car was parked there. Key was sitting on the porch, drinking coffee, looking relaxed. He looked up as we approached, panting and sweating. "Morning, boys," he said cheerfully. "You're back early." I stood there, trying to catch my breath. "Dad, that wasn't funny." He looked confused. What wasn't? The prank. The guys in the woods. The whispering. Dad frowned, putting his mug down. "What are you talking about?" "You said you were going to come scare us," I said, getting angry. "Last night, with the torches." Dad's face dropped. He looked genuinely apologetic. "Oh, mate, I'm sorry. I didn't come out. I only just got back here an hour ago to unlock the house for you." My heart stopped. I looked at Matt and Chris. They looked sick. "You didn't come out?" I asked. "No," he said. "I didn't leave the house all night." "Why?" We told him everything. The bones, the torchlight, the hand on the tent, the whispering. As we spoke, Dad's expression changed from confusion to genuine concern. He wasn't acting. He was dumbfounded. He knew that land better than anyone. And he knew nobody should have been out there, especially that deep in the bush at 1 a.m. We loaded the car and left immediately. I didn't go back to that property for a long time. Interestingly, I did go back a couple of years ago. I was telling this story to a mate, and he wanted to see the spot. I was older, bigger, and we went during the day, so I agreed. It took us a while to find the clearing again, but we eventually found the old fire pit rocks. We scouted around the area, pushing slightly further into the bush than we had that night, about 200 meters from where we'd camped. Hidden behind a thick wall of blackberries and scrub, we found something we'd missed that night. A small shack. It was barely standing, made of rusted corrugated iron and mismatched timber. It looked like it had been there for decades. The metal sheets were pockmarked with holes. Upon closer inspection, they were bullet holes. Large caliber rounds that had punched clean through the iron. Inside it was a mess of rot and dirt. But in the corner, there was a 44-gallon steel drum. We looked inside. It was stuffed full of clothes. Jeans, flannels, boots, all partially burned and fused together. Next to the drum was a neat pile of firewood and 2 rusting axes leaning against the wall. I don't know who was in that shack. I don't know if they were the ones who found us that night. But standing there, looking at those axes and that drum of burned clothes, I realized how lucky we were that the hand on the tent only tapped and didn't try to get in. We haven't been back since. This happened a few years ago, and honestly it still makes me anxious whenever I see a tent. It was the summer when those 2 prisoners escaped from the maximum security facility in upstate New York. If you lived anywhere in the Northeast at the time, you remember it. It was all over the news, national headlines, massive manhunt, roadblocks everywhere. These guys were considered extremely dangerous, and nobody knew where they'd gone. Despite the news, my wife Melissa and I had a camping trip planned for months. We love hiking, and we didn't want to let the situation ruin our plans. We figured the odds of running into them were basically zero. The Adirondacks are massive, millions of acres of wilderness. What were the chances, right? We'd been hiking and camping for 2 days before the incident. The vibe on the trails was definitely weird. Still, we met a few other hikers and some locals, and everyone was on high alert. You couldn't have a conversation without the escapees coming up. People were nervous. Every time a twig snapped, heads would turn. But generally, we felt safe. We had bear spray on each other. On the 3rd night, we decided to really get away from the crowds. We hiked deep into a remote area, way off the popular trails. We wanted that total middle-of-nowhere experience. No cell service, no other campers, just complete isolation. We found a spot in a small clearing surrounded by dense pine trees. It was quiet, too quiet maybe. We set up camp, made a small fire, and tried to relax. But being that isolated, with the news of the escapees in the back of your mind, makes your brain heavy. Every shadow looked like a person. Eventually, though, exhaustion took over. We put out the fire and crawled into the tent. I slept pretty hard until about 5:30 in the morning. I woke up naturally, not because of a noise, but just because my body was done sleeping. The sun wasn't fully up yet. The tent was filled with that dim gray pre-dawn light. It was freezing. I didn't want to get out of my warm sleeping bag yet, so I just lay there, listening to the wind, thinking I might try to drift back to sleep. That's when I heard it. At first, it was just a faint rustle in the woods. I froze. In the woods you get used to the sound of squirrels or chipmunks. They move in short, erratic bursts. This was different. It was heavy, rhythmic crunching of leaves. My heart started beating a little faster. It's probably a deer, I told myself. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The footsteps stopped. Then they started again, but they were closer. Much closer. Then I heard a second set of footsteps from the other side of the clearing. I stopped breathing. Animals don't flank you. I looked over at Melissa. She was still sound asleep, breathing softly. I didn't know if I should wake her and risk making noise or stay quiet and hope whoever it was would pass by. Suddenly, the rustling was right outside the tent walls. I could hear heavy breathing. Not animal panting, human breathing. I sat up slowly, my hand trembling as I reached for the pocket knife I kept in my boot. I was terrified. We were miles from the nearest road. If this were the escapees, we were done for. Before I could even reach over to tap my wife's shoulder, violence erupted out of nowhere. There was no warning. No, come out with your hands up. Just violence. A massive knife blade ripped through the nylon roof of the tent, right above my head. The sound of the fabric tearing was deafening in the silence. I watched in horror as the sky became visible through the slash. "Go," a deep voice screamed. Before I could process what was happening, the entire tent collapsed on top of us. I felt a heavy weight slam into my back. Someone had tackled me through the fabric, pile-driving me into the hard ground. My face was smashed into the dirt. I couldn't breathe. "Show me your hands." I started screaming, and I didn't even realize I was screaming. Melissa woke up screaming too. She was being pinned down next to me. Through the rip in the tent and the chaos, I saw black boots and the barrel of a rifle inches from my head. My brain finally snapped out of the shock and realized something crucial. The guy on top of me was wearing heavy tactical gear. I caught a glimpse of a patch. Police. But they weren't acting like I was a victim. They were acting like I was a threat. They were treating us like we were the "I'm a camper. I'm just camping," I shrieked, my voice cracking. "My name is Mark. I live in Albany. My social security number is..." I started rattling off everything. My address, my social security number, my mother's maiden name. Anything to prove I wasn't a convict. "I'm innocent. Look at my ID. Don't move." The officer on my back roared, pressing the barrel of the gun into my shoulder. "Clear," someone shouted from outside. The pressure on my back eased up slightly, but he didn't let go. "Who are you with?" he barked. "My wife. That's my wife. We're just hiking." It took about 2 minutes for the adrenaline in the clearing to settle down, but it felt like 2 hours. They dragged us out of the collapsed tent, zip-tied our hands initially, and threw us onto the grass. There were 6 of them. SWAT team guys, fully geared up, sweating, eyes wide. They looked just as terrified as we were. Once they shone a flashlight on our faces and realized we were clean-shaven, terrified, and clearly not the 2 hardened criminals they were hunting. The mood shifted. They cut the zip ties. I was shaking so bad I couldn't stand up. Melissa was crying hysterically. One of the officers, an older guy who looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days, took a deep breath and holstered his weapon. He checked our IDs. "Oh no," he muttered. "We thought we had them." Turns out we weren't just in a random spot. A thermal drone had picked up our heat signatures in the middle of the night, because we were so far off the trail in a sector where the prisoners had supposedly been spotted just hours before. The police were 100% convinced they'd found the fugitives' camp. They didn't hail us because they thought we were armed and desperate murderers. They came in fast to prevent a shootout. They apologized, but it was a tense, brief apology. They were still in hunting mode. They told us we had to pack up and leave immediately because the area wasn't safe. Walking back to the car that morning was the longest hike of my life. I kept thinking about that knife slashing through the tent. If I'd been sitting up 2 inches higher, or if I'd tried to stand up when I heard the rustling, I probably would have been stabbed or shot by mistake. We never went back to that spot. And honestly, now I stick to the designated campgrounds where there are plenty of people around. I'd rather deal with noisy neighbors than be mistaken for a fugitive in the middle of nowhere again. Thanks for listening, and if you have a crazy story of your own, let me know in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.